J.J. Decay was excited. He was making his first appearance as the lead singer for the Unpretties, a punk band in Nevermore Hollows that was poised to step from local legends to world-famous rock stars. 6 months earlier, they'd been signed to a major record label that was putting a lot of effort into making the Unpretties the next Green Day. This plan made J.J. cringe. He wasn't a fan of Green Day. Oh, sure, they rocked hard as a pop-punk band, but they were way too commercial and much too mouthy with their politics. Punk had a reputation for being counterculture and in opposition to whatever political party that was in power, but real punk, the punk that gave J.J. a 1,000-watt jolt, was pure punk. Bands like the Pixies, the Misfits, and the Damned and the Cramps. And of course, the most important punk band of all time, the Ramones. Gabba Gabba Hey, now we're talking. J.J. stood in the cramped bathroom in the basements of the Misfits Coffee shop, which the owner, a punk-loving man from New York named Kafka Cobain, had turned into a club. He took a quiet moment to reflect on his life and how he'd gotten to this precipice of success. He never really knew his mom because she'd left when he was a toddler. His dad beat him daily, and at 15, J.J. had run away, seeking peace and safety, but found himself living on the streets and addicted to heroin. After 3 years of this hell, on the morning of his 18th birthday, Kafka found him lying passed out in the alley between Misfits Coffee and Sabbath Black's records and tapes. Kafka had taken him into the coffee shop, got him cleaned up, and put him in rehab. After J.J. got out of rehab, Kafka had given him a job, helped him find an apartment, and taught him that life was worth living. Kafka's love of music, especially punk, was infectious and had given J.J. purpose. Kafka caught J.J. singing one night after closing while he was cleaning up and introduced him to the Unpretties, a local band that needed a singer. Kafka and the Unpretties had changed J.J.'s life. They had done this by giving him a family. That had been a little over a year ago, and here he was about to be a successful musician. It was happening fast, and he loved it. He had found that he had a knack for writing songs. His main theme was shaped by his life on the streets and the realization that change can happen in anybody's life if they are willing to accept some grace. When someone would point out that his lyrics weren't angry enough for punk, he'd reply that a hopeful message sung to a society that had slipped into narcissism, fatalism, and greed was, in fact, counterculture, therefore the new punk. It helped that the Unpretties could really play. They kicked ass on a level that hadn't been seen in a punk band in a long time. Every musician in the band was top-notch. They brought talent, skill, ability, and attitude. And that was why he had locked himself in the bathroom to have a quiet moment of reflection. He did not want to let his brothers down. In fact, J.J. was the 6th singer for the Unpretties. All the others were girls, and they had been murdered in spectacularly violent ways. A couple were even used as human sacrifices to some dark god. The band had been on the brink of success with their last singer, Anna Weathers, but she'd been found dead in the studio they'd been recording in. Her heart had been cut out. But now, all that was behind them, and J.J. would be damned if he failed his family, especially considering that tomorrow they would leave Nevermore Hollows and embark on their first ever world tour as the opening act for the Foo Fighters. This band of brothers deserved success. He considered all this and said, "Screw Green Day. The Unpretties will be the next Ramones." He stepped out of the bathroom and took in the crowd. There were 200 people milling around, drinking coffee and conversing. They were a mixed bag. There were neon mohawks, sparkling piercings, and brightly colored tattoos. JJ wasn't surprised, as some people would be, at the number of normies milling around in their jeans and shorts and plain tees. You didn't have to look punk to be punk. Punk was universal, man. A genre of music that wasn't universal was black metal. Those guys took themselves way too seriously. They were into some extremely dark stuff. It's like they fed off death and darkness. JJ appreciated the musicianship, but not their lyrics or imagery. And he'd learned the hard way that you don't say anything negative about black metal. Those guys were hardcore, treating the genre like a religion. Last year, Kafka hosted a battle of the bands. The bands were varied with straight rock, metal, thrash, even country and jazz. There was also a local black metal band called the Black Cardinals. And when they took the stage, things got weird. The Black Cardinals were not good musicians. They could barely play in tune, let alone in time. They relied heavily on theatrics instead of musicianship. Nobody in Nevermore Hollows liked them. In fact, it was clear that nobody in the state of Georgia liked them because they'd never been able to land a gig anywhere, except for the Battle of the Bands at Misfits Coffee Underground. They modeled their band's persona off an obscure death metal band from the 1980s called Blood Pope. Blood Pope was notorious for their fanatical approach to the genre and their devotion to Satan. And whenever they took the stage, things got very dark. The members of Blood Pope all dressed like nightmarish Catholic popes. They had given themselves provocative stage names. The singer was Pope Hell. The guitar player was Pope Anger. The bass player, Pope Lust. And the drummer was Pope Wrath. They would work their fans into a violent frenzy by performing blood rituals during their concerts and by singing lyrics that were actual black magic spells. The fans would leave their concerts in a bloodlust, and the band was banned in every country except Norway due to the rise in murders after their shows. That alone would have solidified them in dark music lore, but on Halloween night in 1989, they became infamous when they put on their final show. The first song of the set used an ancient invocation to magnify the bloodlust of the crowd, who raged at one another in a hellish mosh pit. During their sixth song, as the crowd slammed and clawed and bit one another, Blood Pope performed an actual human sacrifice. By the end of their 12th song, 219 people had been killed in the violence of the mosh pit. Then, when all that was left of the crowd were ravaged dead bodies, Blood Pope stood before their dead congregation and performed their 13th and final song. During this song, called Hopeless Massacre, the sound engineer and the two roadies carried out the final wishes for the band. They splashed Pope Wrath, the drummer, with gasoline and set him afire. He screamed in rage and pain, but continued to pound the drums. Then, as the final notes rang out, the sound engineer used a cursed sword to eviscerate Pope Lust, the bassist. At the same time, one of the roadies shot Pope Anger, the guitar player, between the eyes with a pistol. They turned to Pope Hell, who stood before the carnage, his chest heaving from the rage of the lyrics and the heat of the bloodlust. His eyes were wide, wild, wicked, and his final words were,
"Send me to hell."
Then the sound engineer swung the cursed sword in a deadly arc and chopped off Pope Hell's head. How a band with such an infamous backstory could inspire anyone was an uncomfortable commentary on the decline of society. But the Black Cardinals embraced Blood Pope's influence as if it were a religion. The band members dressed like Catholic cardinals, only these cardinals were hellish. At one point during their set, during the Battle of the Bands, they made a strange attempt at their own ritualistic sacrifice. Their singer, a 19-year-old kid named Jan Inger, produced a white rabbit from under his black cassock and used a dagger to eviscerate the poor bunny, then drank its blood from a creepy-looking chalice. Kafka had gone upstairs for a coffee refill while this was going on. He heard the crowd literally losing it in disgust and ran back down and threw the Black Cardinals off the stage and out into the street. Kafka loved all kinds of music and embraced theatrics as part of the art form, but he refused to allow anything that seemed like real black magic to be performed on his stage. Later that night, after the Unpretties had won the Battle of the Bands, JJ made a comment about how the Black Cardinals went too far, and from that moment on, Jan and the members of his pathetic band had it out for him. They had started a social media smear campaign against him and the Unpretties, and JJ suspected they were behind the vandalization of his truck. Also, JJ's dog, a mixed breed named Sid Vicious, had gone missing that very week, and JJ feared that the Black Cardinals had captured the poor mutt and used him as a dark sacrifice. But JJ couldn't think about any of that right now. He had to focus. The plan was that the Unpretties would open the show, then let the other two bands play for the rest of the release party. Both of those bands were solid. They were Captain Midnight and the Cemetery Kids, and Rosemary's Other Baby. JJ liked them and felt that they too deserved success. He checked his phone. 10 minutes until he and the rest of the Unpretties took the stage. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Kafka. He was a big man in a bowling shirt with a skull motif and a pork pie hat. With him was Beastie, the drummer for the Unpretties, and Zodiac, the other guitar player and backup singer. Beastie was a wiry guy with short spiky hair dyed violent red. Zodiac had long pink hair and a matching pink mustache that curled at the tips. JJ initially thought he looked stupid, but realized that it was so weird that it was definitely punk.
"You feel the energy, kid?"
Kafka said.
"I got the crowd hopped up on Java, and they're ready to rock. You're gonna knock 'em dead."
"We appreciate you letting us release the record here," JJ replied. Another man walked up. He was tall, looked like a bodybuilder with long black hair and beard. His name was Sabbath Black, the owner of Sabbath Black's Records and Tapes. He had once been the singer of a thrash metal band, but after a tragic event, he retired to Nevermore Hollows and opened up his record shop. He had partnered with Kafka to host the album release party. JJ nodded at him. "And we're thankful for you too, Sabbath."
"My pleasure,"
Sabbath replied in a thrash metal growl. He glanced around the room.
"I remember when we launched our first record. What a night. You just knew that life would never be the same. Look, I know you lot have had your fair share of strange experiences and horrible deaths. Believe me, I've been there. I want you to know there's some blokes out there, evil people, in this business. So keep your heads on straight."
JJ and the rest of the band exchanged knowing looks. They'd all heard about how Sabbath's band had been found one dark night, murdered in the mansion they'd rented to record an album. Supposedly, grizzled cops who had stomachs of steel by seeing the worst that humans could do to each other got sick when they saw the carnage in that mansion. A couple quit the force. Most of them were still in therapy. The only survivor was Sabbath Black, and they found him beaten and cut and tied to a tree in the middle of the woods that were part of the property. Sabbath never spoke of what happened that night. He refused to utter a single word about it. So the fact that he'd just said what he did was a shock. Thunderman, the bass player for the Unpretties, walked up just in time to hear Sabbath's advice. "We appreciate that, Sabbath. We'll keep our heads on straight." Sabbath shook his head.
Look here, mate. When the fame hits, it's going to be harder than you think to do that. But remember, there are dark forces at play, and they use music as one of their weapons. They will do their damnedest to twist you into one of their weapons.
With that, Sabbath turned and walked to the back of the room where Zane, the sound engineer, was tweaking the system. Beastie was by nature an optimist. He flashed the band and Kafka a confident smile. "We're smart, and we have each other. We're going to be okay." Thunderman said, "Word. Together we can resist these dark forces." Zodiac was the youngest in the band. "Well, let's go kick some ass," he said, and headed to the stage. He called back over his shoulder, "Hey, I know we're here to play the songs on our record, but let's kick the show off with Sheena is a Punk Rocker." Thunderman, Beastie, and JJ all smiled. "Hell yeah," Beastie said. "No better way to launch our careers than with a Ramones song." They stepped onto the stage and got ready as Kafka took his place in front of the mic stand and got the crowd focused. Once they were settled, Kafka introduced the band, and Beastie yelled out, "1, 2, 3, 4," then hit the drums. The band locked in and they grooved on the intro to one of the all-time great punk songs from the godfathers of punk. JJ belted out the lyrics to the first verse, glanced around the room, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw a cloaked figure standing at the back of the room beside Zane, the sound guy. Even though the person had the hood up, when the stage lights flashed from red to bright white, JJ caught a glimpse of the face. It was Jan Inger, the singer for the Black Cardinals. Even though this turn of events worried JJ, he kept his cool and sang the first chorus perfectly. As he did, his eyes darted around the room. Crap! There were 4 other people in cloaks peppered around the crowd. They were the rest of the Black Cardinals members. What were these guys doing here? JJ wondered. He knew these douchebags hated him and the rest of the guys in the Unpretties, so if they were here, they would be up to no good. JJ took a breath during the first short instrumental of the song. He focused on Jan and Zane, and his blood turned icy when Zane stepped aside and let Jan have control of the soundboard. What is he doing? Then it hit him. Zane was letting Jan have control of the board so that Jan could sabotage the rest of the show. This was the worst thing that could happen at an album release party. Tonight had to go perfectly. JJ wanted this to be a night that nobody would forget. The Unpretties were already killing it, and it was just the first song. The energy from the crowd flowed up into the stage and seeped into JJ and the rest of the band. The band and the crowd were one, united by the power of the music. But Jan and his lame-ass death metal wannabe band was about to sabotage the whole thing. Jan started manipulating the frequencies, causing a feedback loop that at first couldn't be heard, only felt in the pit of your stomach. The Unpretties tried their best to stay focused and in sync. They shot nervous glances at each other. Sabbath and Kafka had already moved toward the board, ready to stop Jan. But the other cloaked bandmates seized them and held them and began wrestling with them, trying to stop them. Thunderman noticed in the flash of the lights that the Black Cardinals were chanting, though he couldn't hear them over the music and the growing hum of the feedback. People in the crowd stopped dancing, bopping, and nodding along with the music. They put their hands over their ears and turned their attention to the struggle. The hum was now so loud that it reverberated around the room, shaking dust from the ceiling. The hum resonated so thoroughly out of sync that it caused a couple of the crowd members to become so dizzy that they collapsed onto the floor. The Unpretties finished the song and let the final massive overdriven notes ring out, but it only clashed further with the hum. A girl in the crowd screamed. Blood poured from her ears. A dozen more people had bloody noses. Yet others were trying to leave the room but were so disoriented that they stumbled into each other like mindless zombies. Now that the music had died, the chanting was louder, clearer. The manic rhythm of the chanting pulsed in hellish sync with the hum. Sabbath began throwing punches at the cloaked band members holding him. Kafka headbutted another. They broke free and ran toward Jan and the soundboard. Suddenly there was a flash of brilliant red-orange light that left everyone's sight blurry and dimmed. It was accompanied by a shockwave that flung the Unpretties and most of their instruments off the stage. The hum died. And for a single heartbeat, the quiet was as profound as the silence of the grave. It allowed everyone to see that a portal made of hellfire had opened on the stage. Beyond the odd-shaped opening was a blackness so deep that it poisoned the onlookers' hearts with depression. Then, the roar of a power cord slammed from the portal. Music is supposed to resonate with your spirit in an uplifting way, but this cord did the opposite. That single cord conveyed a sulfuric hate and satanic intent to destroy the soul. Another heartbeat of silence. And then movement from inside the abyss. The people in the crowd were just regaining their senses from the onslaught of feedback and shockwave. They bled from their ears and noses. Their eyes watered. A dozen of those that had collapsed were starting to push themselves up off the floor. But then, their discombobulation was dissolved by terror at the sight of what came out of the portal. To gasps of shock and muttered cries of fear, Pope Hell, the decapitated lead singer of Blood Pope, stepped through the portal and stood on the stage. In life, he had been massive, standing 6 feet 5 inches and thick with muscle that was evident even through his Pope costume. His long hair had been twisted into a dozen braids that snaked from under his papal mitre. His face had been smeared with red and black grease paint in a kabuki style that distorted the shape of his face into a mask of madness. In death, he was even more terrifying as he stood before the crowd. He was dressed in costume and held his head in his upturned palms as if it were a sacred relic. Then, slowly, deliberately, The head was raised high, as if being held aloft for everyone to worship its sacrilege. The flesh behind his kabuki makeup was rotted and peeling. His eyes were milky with death. When he smiled, his teeth, which he'd filed to sharp points when alive, were still there but tainted with decay. Blackened lengths of suture thread hung from the neck. The room was as quiet as a desecrated church. Every eye gazed upon the unholy vulgarity. Then, slowly, the hand settled the hand onto the stump of neck protruding between the shoulders. The sutures began writhing like grave worms and dug themselves into the rotted flesh. In less than a minute, they had secured the head to the body. The portal remained open behind him, and Pope's anger, lust, and wrath stepped through and onto the stage. Their bodies were also in decay. Their elaborate costumes did little to hide the wounds that had killed them, especially those of Pope Wrath. His cassock and mitre were practically melted into his charred body, and hateful energy poured from them. In a voice that seemed to come from a throat full of grave dirt, Pope Hell said,
"Who has done this?"
When the portal had opened, the Unpretties had been thrown off the stage. During the initial confusion, the Black Cardinals had captured Beastie, Thunderman, and Zodiac because they had been blown off the front of the stage. However, they had not been able to capture JJ because the shockwave had tossed him off the side of the stage. Jan, followed by the other 4 members of the Black Cardinals, pushed through the crowd with the captured Unpretties in tow. They stood in front of the stage, and Jan said, "We have done this." Pope Hell let his milky eyes settle on Jan. He grimaced in disgust.
"Why?"
Jan's look of smug reverence mutated into a mask of confusion. "Because we want you to give us your unholy blessing so that we can be famous." Pope Lust gave a hollow laugh.
"Fame? We don't give a damn about fame."
Jan winced and frowned. "But, I don't understand. Isn't that why you learned how to work dark magic into your shows and why you killed all those people?" When Pope Wrath shook his head, flakes of charred skin fell from his face.
"We worked the magic for our devotion to Satan. We killed for the blood."
Suddenly, in a dark chorus, the members of Blood Pope grumbled,
"All for the blood."
From the moment the portal was opened to the uttering of that wicked declaration, only 2 minutes had passed. Zane, the sound engineer, said, "Screw this," and ran to the exit. Pope Anger cut his death-curdled eyes at Zane and said,
"No one leaves this room alive."
He pointed a finger, and Zane exploded into a spray of blood that splattered everyone within a 10-foot radius. People screamed and gasped and cried, but no one else dared move. Jan was shaking. He was scared. All the effort he'd put into researching how to conjure the band by using black magic and sound frequencies was on the verge of backfiring. He wanted to be famous and perform all over the world. He didn't want to die at the hands of the band he worshipped. I offer you this band, the Unpretties, as a sacrifice. I ask that you make me and my band famous, but I also brought you back so that you can reign as evil princes here on earth."
"You fool,"
Pope Hell growled.
"Why would we want to be princes on earth when we were kings in hell?"
Kafka and Sabbath stepped closer to the stage.
"I don't care whether princes or kings,"
Kafka said.
"I don't give you any authority in my coffee shop."
Pope Hell sneered. His eyes settled questioningly on Sabbath. Sabbath tilted his head toward Kafka.
"What he said, cunt."
Pope Hell didn't acknowledge Kafka's or Sabbath's defiance. Instead, he turned his hateful gaze on Jan.
"We accept your offer of this band as sacrifice."
He stepped off the stage and grabbed Zodiac by the throat and lifted him up.
"I'll take this one."
Then he glanced over his shoulder at his unholy bandmates.
"You can have the rest of the Unpretties."
When JJ heard Pope Hell say he'd take the Unpretties as a sacrifice, his blood ran cold. The Unpretties was more than a band. It was a family. It was his family. And he was going to fight for them. Fear caused him to struggle to find his voice, but finally he was able to say, "Leave my brother alone." Pope Hell looked slowly over at JJ.
"What did you say to me?"
JJ was so terrified he thought his knees would buckle. But he pushed his fear down, stood straighter, stuck his chin out in defiance, and stepped up onto the stage. "I said, put him down." Pope Lust took a step forward and looked down at him.
"Oh, what?"
JJ wasn't prepared for that question. All he knew was that he couldn't let these monsters kill another person in this club. But how could he stop them? The situation was dire and seemingly hopeless. His streetwise intuition told him the best approach was to be bold. Then, the most punk rock retort rocked his mind. "Or I'll kick your ass." Pope Hell gave a derisive snort that caused a spiral of smoke to swirl from his nostrils. It smelled of brimstone.
"You are no match for us. We have the powers and authority of hell at our disposal."
In testament to his power, Pope Hell pointed at a girl who was silently sobbing and snapped his fingers. There was a wet pop as she disappeared in a crimson spray. The room again erupted into chaos. People ran for the exits, the stairs leading up to the coffee shop, and crawled under tables. As they did, they bumped and slammed and stumbled into each other. Blood Pope saw this as their opportunity for a higher body count. They began pointing their fingers at the crowd. There were dozens of explosions of bloody spray. 2 of the members of the Black Cardinals were among the dead. Jan dropped onto the floor and skittered away like a scared cockroach. It was clear that his plan had backfired. The death toll in this room was rising, and he knew that he was about to die. Suddenly, he knew how to save himself. When he'd been researching the dark arts to learn how to conjure Blood Pope, he'd read that a person who was willing to sacrifice themselves for others would close the portal and send Blood Pope back to hell. In his lust for fame, that idea had seemed alien to him, and he'd relegated it to the trash bin of his mind. But now, he hoped that it would be what would save his life. "A willing sacrifice is the way to beat them," he yelled. Pope Hell shot him an angry look, snapped his fingers, and Jan exploded into a crimson spray. Kafka saw the chaos as his opportunity to act. He jumped up onto the stage, headed for Pope Hell. Sabbath leaned across the stage and grabbed a handful of Pope Lust's cassock and yanked, pulling him off balance. JJ saw his bandmates scrambling to break free of their duct tape restraints and head for the stage to help Kafka and Sabbath engage Blood Pope in battle. JJ would not let his two mentors or his bandmates, all of whom had become his family, die. All this flashed through his mind in mere seconds. He'd heard what Jan had yelled. That little cockroach was a terrible musician and a shitty singer, but he clearly knew the dark arts. JJ felt in his gut that a willing sacrifice was in fact the only way to stop the carnage and save his family. And he had a lyric that would fit the moment. So he ran around the stage, behind Blood Pope as they turned people in the crowd into crimson sprays, and gazed into the portal. The ring of fire contained a black void that emanated despair. He could see nothing in that blackness, and he was hammered with a fear so deep that it sickened him. He trembled so violently that his knees nearly buckled, and he doubted he could go through with his plan. Then, behind him, he heard Kafka cry out in pain. He glanced over his shoulder to see that Pope Hell was choking him with a sickening smile on his face. Pope Hell was killing him slowly. In that moment, the fear left JJ. He was calm, resolved, brave. He turned his back to the void, taking in the chaotic scene, and yelled, "Hey, asshats, look at me!" The room became still and quiet as everyone stopped and turned their attention on him. Standing directly in the center of the circle of fire, the void behind him, he was a punk rock vision of green mohawk and studded leather jacket. Pope Hell's milky eyes shot wide. He dropped Kafka and pointed his finger at JJ, ready to turn him into a bloody mist. The other popes looked just as surprised, but before they could react, JJ quoted a lyric from their first single, called Punk Ain't Dead, which was on their new record. He held up his arms, his hands holding up peace signs, and he said, "The thing about the grave is, if you want to live, you have to die. Peace out, bitches. It's my time to fly." Then he fell backwards through the portal and into the void. There was another bright flash of fire-colored light that blurred everyone's vision and a crackling of static. Then, when the light faded, Blood Pope was gone. And so was JJ. The next few weeks after the record release party was filled with truth and skepticism. When those who were there told the truth of what had happened, nobody believed them. Everyone chalked it up to a drug-fueled concert that ended in a tragic stampede that killed 20 people. It was a comfortable narrative that people embraced to make sense of an uncomfortable world. If they accepted that a supernatural event had taken place, that would force them to consider the truth of the soul and what happens to it upon death. There were others who said it was a clever marketing strategy conjured up by the record company to build a legend and to increase downloads and sales. But no one could explain the disappearance of JJ, and they didn't want to. But the survivors of that night would never forget what JJ had done to save them. And neither would Kafka and Sabbath and the remaining members of the Unpretties. They mourned deeply, but they knew that to honor JJ's sacrifice, they must move on. The band must continue because J.J. had loved them enough to sacrifice himself so that they could continue as a band and as a family. And families remember the loss of a loved one by living. So, Kafka and Sabbath decided to become the co-managers of the Unpretties, and the band began auditioning for a new singer. They made a conscious, reverent choice to live in the face of loss, and in doing so, they honored J.J.'s sacrifice.